I get to introduce Mr. TJ Woodward. Yeah, that's how I feel. And I'll share with you a brief anecdote about why I work with TJ at Conscious Recovery. How does that sound? Does that sound pretty good? You want to know why? Okay, I'll tell you. So I've been in recovery for 12 years. It'll be 13 in January. Thank you.
No fronts.
What?
No fronts.
No fronts. That's right.
Just 12 in a few months.
That's right. And I remember when I first got sober, it was very exciting. Everything felt new. Everything felt alive. And at some point along the line, I'd say about 2 years in, I had this very stark realization that while I was no longer addicted to drugs and alcohol, I was still addicted to these other things like external validation, things, stuff, right? I was still addicted to this thought that I would be better if fill in the blank. And that lasted for a very long time. I wasn't using drugs and I wasn't drinking, but there was something missing. I felt as though I wasn't enough. Can anybody relate? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So fast forward to 2017 or 2018, the dates get a little blurry, and I meet TJ Woodward, a colleague of ours up in Northern California, Noelia. Anybody know Noelia? Oh yeah, we love her. She said, you've really got to meet this guy TJ Woodward because I think that you two would have a lot to talk about. So TJ and I met for coffee, and it turned into like a 3-hour philosophical deep dive into what recovery could be in treatment facilities. And in that, he talked about his upcoming book, Conscious Recovery. And I said, well, hey, man, send me a copy. I'd love to read it. So I got it in my email as a PDF. Okay, this is before it was print. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't really like reading on my phone or my iPad. It's just not the same. But I read the whole book in one sitting. And at the end of the book, TJ says, a gentle reminder of the truth. You are whole. You are perfect. You deserve a life filled with love, curiosity, and awe. And it floored me. And I thought to myself in that moment, what would it have created if somebody had told me that when I first got sober? That I'm whole and perfect, just like this. That all of us are whole and perfect, just like this. And despite the narratives in our culture and all the marketing we're saturated with every single day about if we only had that one thing, we could live a better life, and oh, if more people loved us, we could be more happy, right? TJ says, we are whole and perfect just as we are. And when we go to treatment facilities and facilitate trainings for the clinical staff, I am amazed every single time at how much they need to hear that too. Because it's true, and we forget often because of all the seemingly loud reminders in the world that somehow we're broken. But we're not. None of us in recovery, none of us in the world. And TJ's book and his work is centered around this idea that as we are spiritual beings, we are eternal and we are complete. That there is a place within us that is unharmed and unharmable. So when I read that, I was like, you hiring, dude, or what, you know? And so my work with TJ has been leveraging my unique skills and talents to help spread that message as loudly and as widely as humanly possible. So that being said, let's give a huge round of applause for TJ Woodward.
Wow. Thank you, everyone. I always like to start with gratitude. And so I want to start with gratitude. First of all, Jeremy, thank you for that. I remember that moment, those 3 hours, where we really did take a deep dive into what are the infinite possibilities of what we can do, who we can be, and what we can create in what we call addiction treatment. Gratitude for that, but also gratitude for this moment and for each of you and for the presence that I've experienced and the love that I have really felt from each of you in this very incredible experience that is Emergence. And also just so incredibly grateful that you all came here for our first, but definitely not last, Emergence Conference. I also want to start with just a moment of getting centered and setting an intention. So if it feels okay for you, I invite you to put both feet on the floor, and if it feels okay for you, gently close your eyes, and if not, make it your own. And then I invite us together to take a nice, deep, conscious breath. And on the exhale, simply allowing ourselves to drop down into that place within ourselves that is whole and perfect. That deep inner wisdom, that place that's never been harmed. It's unharmed and unharmable. So we simply tune into that right in this moment and set the intention for our time together for this next hour to be open and receptive and play in the field of infinite possibilities. Knowing that every word, every glance, every moment is a moment where we can each step more fully into the reality of who and what we really are. So we just take a few moments in the silence. And then as you feel ready, you can gently open your eyes. So I want to start with a quote from Nikola Tesla, who said, "The moment we start measuring non-physical phenomenon, we will make more progress in a decade than we did in the previous 100 years. I'm going to say it again, because of course it's a paraphrase anyway. The idea is that if we start to study non-physical phenomenon, we will make more advances in a decade than we did in the past 100 years. And that's really what I hope to bring today, is a conversation about what that might mean to explore the non-physical. And I want to name that we are emerging out of the pandemic, and that there has been a strong focus on the physical aspect of COVID-19. And although it is important, those of us who work in behavioral health understand that there is also mental, emotional, and spiritual consequences, not only of COVID-19, but everything that we did to try to prevent people from getting sick. In other words, I find that sometimes the remedy or the solution might be in some way useful and in some ways not. And so I'm going to be a little clearer about that. So we sheltered in place, and we even used the word lockdown. Now I want to tell you something. I have been locked down. That was not lockdown. I legitimately, they have been, no, you're not leaving this room here that's 6 by 6, okay? So I can tell you that what we went through wasn't that, but we had a narrative that we were locked down, and what did that create? What did it create when we were told that we need to be afraid of each other? Don't touch, don't hug, don't be around anyone that you don't know because you might get sick. And I want to be clear, that is and was really important. And in addition to that, those of us who are care providers in this industry, in this field, and for me, this calling, is that there's also an emotional and spiritual impact of what we called shelter in place and everything that came up around it, and the division that we saw in our country and the polarization, and we spoke to this throughout the day. Now, why do I start with that? I start with that because on one hand, I can say that one thing that I can be sure of is that we have job security for the next few years. Now, why do we have this job security in the next few years? Because people are hurting, right? People are re-experiencing trauma on a scale that I don't know if we are yet aware of. I read a fascinating article during the AIDS pandemic when it was early that this doctor said, studying trauma We don't usually have the symptoms of the trauma until the trauma is over. And in the midst of the AIDS pandemic, people all went into fight, flight, or freeze. And if you're anything like me, which I'm going to talk about my own story, my default is freeze. So I froze during that, and it was really easy to freeze during COVID-19. And so as we thaw out, we're going to start to experience everything that has been right below the surface. And I know many of you who work in treatment are already walking through this in profound ways. So my invitation for us today in this moment is to check in and ask ourselves, are we ready to be a presence for what is needed on planet Earth right now? I want to be a mouthpiece, a small mouthpiece, and hopefully a mouthpiece with a megaphone that says, we are more alike than we are different. We celebrate and honor our differences, and we at the same time celebrate an inherent oneness that lives within each of us. That voice, to me, is what's wanted and needed on planet Earth right now. And we don't need to wait for a leader or a spiritual giant to tell us that. Each of us has the ability to do that right now. That I love you exactly as you are. I want to start with my own story because my own story, I think, informs how I came to my point of view and my perspective on recovery, on addiction, on trauma, on healing, on just about all of it. Dallas, he jokes, are we going to get the butterfly? Are we going to get the blade of grass? Are we going to, I tell some of the same stories. And my husband, Will, is here. He's like, honey, just don't tell the tiger story, whatever you do. But I'll tell you later. And then we just did the Conscious Recovery for Teens workbook, and the co-author, Dr. Jessica Bird Olmsted, we have to use that tiger story. So I went to Will, honey, she loves the tiger story. What can I say? I came into the world and I remember being extremely happy, filled with joy, absolutely present, and deeply connected with myself and the world. And I remember experiencing joy, awe, wonder, connection. And as my friend likes to say, and all of that changed the day I went to kindergarten. Which isn't really my story, but it sounded good at the moment. I grew up in a family that looked really good on the outside. 4-bedroom house, 2 cars. My dad was a school teacher. Mom was a stay-at-home mom. I think if she had been born 20 years later, she probably wouldn't have chosen to be a mother. One way I know that is she used to say to us, I wish I hadn't chosen to be a mother. Thanks, Mom. And I say that in the most loving way because I have a great deal of compassion for her. She grew up in the Midwest in the 1950s, and she was essentially taught you can be what they used to call a stewardess, right, or a nurse, or you can be a secretary, as they used to call it, or you can be a stay-at-home mom. And she opted for that. She has 4 sisters. She and all of them were sexually abused. They all struggled with eating disorders. My aunts, 3 of them were 300 pounds plus. She met a man, also known as my father, who has 2 brothers that were on the other end of that spectrum. I know we're recording this and it's okay, but I want to just be a little more transparent about what was really going on. When I first got sober, I used to say, it's so interesting. I have symptoms of someone who has sexual trauma. Isn't that interesting? And I walked around that way for 5 years in my recovery, being curious why certain things triggered an emotional response that Jason Schiffman so beautifully shared about earlier. That when I felt anything like sexual attraction, love, connection, a wall went up. My dad and his brothers. My uncle had a sexual relationship with his daughter from the time she was 3 years old until she was 18, and was supposedly gay. There's a lot of layers there. What I can say is that when I was in the presence of my dad and his uncles, I was terrified. And I didn't know what that was about. I went back to my childhood home. I grew up in a very small town in Indiana. I went back to my childhood home and we took a tour, because back there you can still knock on the door and say, we used to live here. And they actually knew who we were, what year we were lived there, and what year we moved away. And we got to tour the house, and when we got to the stairs going down to the basement, I remembered. That was the moment I knew it was real, and that I could finally acknowledge to myself that what happened in the basement wasn't something that I made up. So at the age of 7, I had a profound experience of closing my heart. And I actually remember it like it was yesterday. I can remember my mom and my 2 sisters at the dining room table, and I can remember this physical sensation of closing off. Now, we might call that a coping mechanism. In conscious recovery, we call it a brilliant strategy, which I will share with you more in a while. But my brilliant strategy was to close my heart and to put a wall around my heart, and it saved my life. The issue was, though, it also saved me from the love and connection that I so deeply desired. And when Jason earlier was talking about attachment and that we need to have an attachment with the caregiver, he was saying it so eloquently. That was my experience, because I came into this family system where mom didn't really want to be a mom. One day she looks up at the we're eating, she looks up at the ceiling and says, Tom, if you're having an affair, I don't want to know. We all knew, everyone knew. We moved away from a very small town when I was 7 years old, sort of in the middle of the night. He was a school teacher. You can kind of do the math, right? He was told, just please move to another school district. So the reason I'm sharing all of this is that I came into a family system where what people were saying, what people were doing, and the energy that I experienced were 3 totally different and incongruent things. The light side of that is, I took a personality test some years ago, and my number 1 trait was highly attuned to the motivation of others. Because I had to be highly attuned to the motivation of others to survive. The shadow side of that is that I decided at a very young age a few key things. I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, and I'm unlovable. And I walked around with that belief, but much more than a belief. I walked around with that frequency, that energy, that beingness that I was broken and damaged, and I experienced it everywhere. By the time I was 13 or 14, it's a little foggy, but I discovered weed, I discovered alcohol. They saved my life. Literally the most brilliant strategy I've ever found. And I don't know about any of you. Marianne, I know you're with me on this. When Jason was talking about those drugs, I'm like, ooh, that all sounds like so much fun. Right? So I actually remember, I'm dating myself a little, but I remember being really young and watching the Don't Do Drugs videos. And I was like, write down the names of those now, and I'm going to do them. Like, the flame on a stove turned into a carnation, and the person would touch it and burn their fingers. I'm like, that is cool. That's what I want, right? Because I wanted to escape from the experience of now. And the experience or the frequency or the vibration or the core false belief of my own unworthiness. I needed relief, and I found it at age 14. And then I found it again at age 20 when I discovered ecstasy. So when he was talking about MDMA today, I'm like, yeah, I can tell you. Whew, serotonin release is an understatement. Yes, I love all of you. Isn't that interesting? The substance that I was using to bring the experience that I was desiring is still the fundamental truth. I do want to connect and love. And I found it in drugs, and I found it in alcohol, and they brought relief for me and love and connection. But darn it, we all know they just didn't keep working that way. I got sober somewhat young, almost 21, so just over 35 years ago. Don't do the math. Just over 35 years ago. And I want to echo what Jeremy said. I got sober and I was so relieved. I was so happy to be sober. I had what we call a pink cloud, right? I was so grateful that I was showing up to work. I was so grateful that I was connecting with people and loving people and having these incredible experiences of community. And then at 18 months sober, I found myself suicidal. And I was suicidal because I hadn't yet addressed anything that was actually underneath the addiction. I understood intellectually that the addiction itself was not the problem, but I didn't yet understand what was underneath there, only that it was too scary to look. And I got sober at a time and a place where the paradigm or the narrative was, don't worry about anything but just not drinking. If you don't drink today, you're a miracle. Now go help someone. And that worked really well for a long time, until the day that I said, well, I'm doing that, but I literally want to die. And I met a woman who changed my life. I dedicate my entire life to her and my life's work to her. Her name is Mary Helen Brownell. She passed away in 1998, and on her deathbed, now this is a little dramatic. Sometimes I can be a little dramatic the way I recount a story. It wasn't on her deathbed, but close to her death. Actually, her last words, do you want to hear her last words? Someone should probably cancel my hair appointment. Now, those are some profound last words as she's being wheeled into the emergency room or surgery. But toward the end of her life, or toward the end of this chapter of her life, this body that she inhabited, because I believe we're all still here. God, feel that, right? And you talked about Brugge, Mary Helen, all of our ancestors and our teachers are here in this moment. But she said to me, she was Southern, so great, darling, you're so extroverted, and I appreciate that. I know you're going to take this message and you're going to blast it out in ways that I never could. Because her gift, she would never, ever do this. There was no money in the world that would get her to stand on a stage. Her gift was one-on-one. And she would sit with me for hours and listen to me talk about how damaged I was, how broken I was, how the world was unfair, how I was a victim, how I don't know how to communicate. I keep choosing partners that are unavailable. And she would just sit and behold me and say, darling, you're so precious. And I would literally feel sick to my stomach because it was completely incongruent with the core idea I had about myself. It was inconsistent with the vibration of my own unworthiness. She introduced me to a path of recovery that wasn't about attaining something, it was about reclaiming and returning to my own wholeness. I came into the world as a whole and perfect, I use the word spiritual being, and through a series of events called Planet Earth, I lost or believed I lost that connection. So recovery became about how do I return to that. So that has become my life's work. I started working in the field kind of accidentally. I'm just going to tell you right now, it was not my plan. My plan, my education and my whole framework was spirituality. I had a spiritual community in San Francisco. I was doing spiritual counseling, spiritual leadership. That was it. And then my friend was working at this amazing place called Altamira up in Sausalito. And when he told me about it, I knew very deeply that that was mine to do. As a matter of fact, I sent my resume to Carolyn, and she's like, I'm sorry, thank you so much for applying, but you don't have any experience in the addiction treatment field. Do you like the way I'm doing this? This is very Jeremy Miller. In the addiction treatment field, but thank you for submitting your application. And I sat with it for like an hour, and I responded, that's really weird because I know I'm supposed to work there. And she literally called me 15 minutes later, like, no one's ever done that. I at least need to meet you. And so I came in sort of through the side door. And the side door was that my background and my training wasn't clinical in nature, it was spiritual in nature. And my whole journey was about returning to my true nature and removing all the obstacles, as Rumi so beautifully said, all the obstacles or the barriers that I've put over my heart. So I started working in the field, and I started with a fundamental question. And that question has now become the foundational principle of conscious recovery. And the question is, what if underneath all addictive behavior is an essential self that's whole and perfect? Because I noticed a few things really quickly when I started in this field. And they brought me in to do spiritual care, which I'm so grateful for. And I developed spiritual care programs at a couple of different residential and outpatient treatment programs. And I sat in clinical meetings, and I heard clinicians referring to their clients as their diagnosis. He's so borderline, she's so bipolar, right? And sometimes even with an eye roll. And I want to be clear, I'm not judging that, because this is intense work, right? It's intense work. And when we're on the front lines day in and day out, I think in some ways we might believe it's easier just to look at them as the other, look at them as damaged or broken in some way, and how do I help fix them? So I started asking myself the question, what might happen if I were to view whoever I'm sitting with through this lens of wholeness? So quantum mechanics is now measuring this, right? The observer has a profound effect. And is anyone here a quantum physicist before I go on? Okay, yeah, Jeremy Miller is. Okay, so you can correct me if I get the facts wrong, alternative facts. Sorry, I had to say it. Okay. I don't know where that came from. The observer has a profound effect. So if I'm looking for what's broken within you, there's a higher probability that it will show up and that we will experience it. And so I heard people being referred to as their diagnosis. And one of the reasons I love Jason Schiffman, and he's not here now, so I'm going to say something that I heard him say years ago that was profound for me. And he alluded to it today when he talked about the cluster of symptoms. Right? So if you have 3 of these and 2 of these for more than X number of weeks, we call that borderline personality disorder. Right? We label you as disordered. And the issue is many of us are taught that it's biological or chemical. And it might be, but it might not be. And as Jason said earlier, we don't know. And I think the most liberating thing I can tell myself is I don't know. Because then I can become curious. I'm curious if rather than looking at the diagnosis or the symptoms as the problem, like he said, you have headache, sweats, and fever syndrome, right? And look at the root of it. So the other thing I became curious about really early in my work in this field is seeing clients come back to treatment 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Karen talked about this so beautifully, right? The ones that get the A in treatment, right? They know how to I can present really well, and then I leave, and then what? And so I asked myself, well, this is what I heard people saying. A client would come back to treatment, and I would hear a clinician, well-meaning counselor, clinician, tech, say, what are you going to do differently this time? Which, of course, is a vitally important question. But are we asking ourselves, in addition to that, am I asking myself what I can do differently? And so I started exploring these 2 possibilities. Like, what if we actually could start helping people heal the underlying root causes of addiction rather than just treating symptoms? I know clients who could stand up here and teach a relapse prevention class better than anyone in this room. So do we learn through the mind only? Or is there something really different in the way we actually experience change? And so because of my own story and because of my years of work in this field, I've come to an awareness of the root causes of addiction. Now, this might be the root causes of addiction. So try it on and see how it feels for you. Unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame. And so we talk about trauma a lot. We talk about big T and little t trauma. I'm just going to name it. I'm not a fan. And I'm going to tell you why. True story, I could not tie my shoes when I was in kindergarten. And at that moment, I decided I was stupid. And that decision stayed with me until I was 40 years old. I did not go back to school until I was 40 years old. because I'm too stupid for that. Now, that would be really easy to call. That's a little t trauma, right? You couldn't tie your shoes. The person sitting next to me was raped. How can I compare them? And so if you are a human being who was born on planet Earth, unless you had Mr. Rogers as your teacher and your parent, you probably were not given the message, at least not the whole message, that you're whole and perfect just the way you are, right? And so being born on planet Earth, at least spiritually, can be a traumatic experience. As Don Miguel Ruiz says, the domestication of the human. We become domesticated to believe we're other than whole and perfect. And so if it's true that the unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame are the root causes of addiction, how do we actually start to heal those? I'm on a mission, and my mission is that we stop calling ourselves treatment programs, and that we at least shift it to healing centers. And I mean, what I'd really like to see is wholeness and wellness centers, but I might be asking too much right now, but we'll see how that goes. I want to shift gears a little, and Jeremy has a microphone. I love conversations, so I'm not going to say, do you have any questions? I'm going to ask you, what do you want to add to this conversation? There is a microphone going around. What I want to say before we start passing the microphone is that I have witnessed profound transformation in a client that can happen in an instant when I behold the wholeness within them. And I can tell 100 stories about that, and if you all don't talk a lot, I'll tell some of those. That wasn't meant to be a threat. I'll tell the tiger story, honey. I'll tell the tiger story. No, I'm going to tell one story very briefly. There was a young man, 19 years old, diagnosed with schizophrenia. Everything was exactly right on target. He was the right age, and he was having spiritual ideology. They were calling it that, right? He was having these experiences that he was calling spiritual, and they were calling psychosis. And so the good news for me is I'm the spiritual guy, right? So I don't have to go diagnose him. I can just sit with him. And I just sat with him, and I was holding a space for his own wholeness, and he began to cry. I didn't say anything to him. He began to cry because everyone in his life was telling him that he was broken. This is through his lens, I want to be clear. I don't know if they really were. But his interpretation was, Mom was telling me I'm broken, the counselors are telling me I'm broken, the therapists are telling me I'm broken, I have this horrible thing, that I'm not living in reality, that I am hallucinating. He had all these things, and he was terrified. And I just sat with him and asked him to share what was happening for him. And so it is true that asking questions and being open and exploring something deep within a client can be really powerful. And what I discovered, looking at the levels of burnout we have in our field, I discovered something that to me is so simple, and that is when I have felt exhausted, burnt out, and depleted, 100% of the time it's because I wanted the clients to do something, get something, or change in some way. The group needed to go my way, it needed to be a certain way. I need them to have the breakthrough. Right? And that was exhausting for me. And when I just held the space for him, we became really curious about what was called psychosis, and he just started opening up and sharing with me. And there was something that happened within him that was a profound shift in his own awareness of who and what he was. I'm not saying that wouldn't it be great if I could say, and then he never had another psychotic feature? That's not the case, but what happened is in that moment, I could see him reconnect with himself. And I do think a lot of times, Karen spoke to this, a lot of times she didn't say it this way, but we're at war with the part of someone that is resisting treatment rather than being curious about the part of them that wants to be here. Right? And so it takes two people to be in a tug of war. So if I can gently release the rope and be curious and really ask that person and hold that person and energetically see, because most of the way we communicate is energy anyway, it's not words. So why do I think I have to say something? right? So let me be curious about the part of them that wants to be there. So let's open it up for questions, comments, smart remarks, conversation. We have like 20 minutes. We're going to hang out together. What do you want to see emerge in our field? What's emerging for you? What's showing up as I'm speaking? How was lunch? It doesn't matter. Okay, so Jeremy's going to pass the microphone. We do want you to speak into the mic so we can all hear you. I love silence. I can hold space for a long time.
Oh, good, my hand is active.
Hi, I'm Ken. So I just finished my master's program in March, so I'm newly into the field of therapy. And something that my psychopharmacology teacher actually said that was really profound to me was that as we get advancements in sort of like neuropsych and neurobiology, with brain imaging and stuff like that, we're seeing things that we didn't totally understand before.
Yeah.
And with that comes sort of the idea that actually in the frontal lobe of our brains, we have something called mirror neurons, and that when we sit with someone else, they connect, on some chemical, energetic level.
Yeah.
Our brains are actually communicating to one another.
That's right.
And that they will attempt to find synergy, so that when you're sitting with someone who is depressed or anxious or whatever they're experiencing, if you can hold space for them,
Yeah.
you can actually help regulate them.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's just really profound to me.
It's massively profound, right? And so one of the reasons I'm going back to Jason Schiffman because I just love him so much. He comes from a very brain science perspective, and I am over here, the meditation spiritual guy, and we're coming to the same conclusion, right? That this is about that we've severed attachment from ourselves and our primary caregivers, and we've developed this core wounding that we call shame, and then we're trying to heal that in absolutely every relationship we have, whether we're conscious of it or not. And the therapeutic alliance can be what you're talking about, right? And so simply said, we know that neuroplasticity in the brain now, the more we do something, we literally create a groove. I think that's where we get the term stuck in a groove. We do the same thing over and over and over again. We're not conscious of the way we brush our teeth. It's automatic. And so for most of us, myself included, most of the way we are in the world is automatic. And the way it relates to this is when I behold someone, and that word might not work for you, when I hold a space for someone, when I see through the symptoms and the behaviors and the presentation, and when I quit fighting the part of them that wants to resist the moment, and I just hold a space, healing happens. And what I think is happening right now is science is starting to study what we're talking about here. Wow, this connection that happens that we don't really fully understand, but we all understand, right? I'm thinking about West Coast Symposium and the dinner that we had, and just, like sitting with Joe and Jen, I felt healed, right? I felt healed because these are beautiful humans, and we didn't say anything. Joe Tenervan didn't have any profound words of wisdom. His being, I don't mean that you don't, his beingness created something, right? And Mary Helen, my first spiritual teacher, she saw something in me that I didn't have the ability to see in myself. She looked past the brokenness, and I'm going to guess from a brain science standpoint, and I'm sorry to say it that way, but I'm clearly not a doctor, and you're all very lucky. Something happens in the brain and it gets reprogrammed and rewired. And we actually are now recognizing that genes themselves are not as solid as we once believed. Right, that we actually can change our DNA by healing trauma. Just lean into that for a moment. Because, sometimes it's fun to be in a debate. The mind likes to debate. Is it genetic? Is it nature or nurture? That's an interesting question. What if it's both, and what if they're not actually separate? Right, we actually start to heal, and the body responds to thought, it responds to energy, it responds to presence. That's why we see mindfulness now as a evidence-based practice. Okay, thank you. Who's next? I know you all have a lot to say.
Just something you just said about the mind and it debating. It reminded me of, I do some similar stuff to what you're pointing to.
Yeah.
And that if you feel what a mind feels like on the felt sense level, it seems like a lot of the thinking that we do in our society is traumatized.
Yeah.
And that is in a like agitated, activated
Yeah.
state. And I'm in school right now getting my AOD education, and when they're talking about CBT as a go-to,
Yeah.
I'm like baffled how they can expect an agitated mind to be a source of really accessing that place.
I am so grateful you said that, and I want to speak to it because it's so important what he's offering. If it were just as simple as changing my mind, we wouldn't even have treatment programs, well, healing centers, right? If it were just because we look at, the reason that in conscious recovery we call them core false beliefs rather than core beliefs is that we've created lies about ourselves, right? And we are holding that to be true. And then we come into treatment and we're like, well, just have opposite action or change the thought. And I want to be clear, it is important. And there's more, right? It's never this or that. It's always this and that. So yes, there's a cognitive reframing that can happen. You know, I remember like, oh, I'm going to look in the mirror and I'm going to say, you are deserving of love and appreciation. And those affirmations helped a lot, but it wasn't completely changing anything until I got down and really healed the original wound. And what do I mean by that? I now get to parent myself the way that I wasn't parented as a child. Not from any place of good, bad, right, wrong, but like what happened for me, and I mean that, the sexual trauma was for me on a soul level, because I would not be doing this work without that. I literally would not be standing here if that didn't happen, right? To get down and to care for the 3-year-old, the 4-year-old, the 5-year-old, starting with it's okay for you to feel. Right, it's okay to feel. Go to your room so you stop crying, or I'm going to give you something to cry about. Boys don't cry. All the messages. And so holding that space for that part of me that we might call a wound or an inner child, that's the work, and it can happen in an instant. I don't mean there's a finish line. See, sometimes we talk about trauma, and I appreciate all the science that goes into how we heal trauma. And sometimes it becomes so simple for me. If it's true that addiction or substance use or any behavior, sex, shopping, whatever it is a brilliant strategy trying to help me feel something more or something less, in other words, I'm trying to escape from now, and that trauma is activating that, because we don't use the word trigger in conscious recovery, we use activate, something got touched. If that's true, and my default is escaping, then recovery is about learning how to be present with myself, even if it's for 30 seconds. So trauma healing can happen, because people say, well, we're a 28-day program. How can we help someone heal their trauma? We're going to get them the long-term care they need after treatment with the trauma specialist. All sounds great. But what about that moment when the client experiences either pain or shame or discomfort? Can we just allow the person sitting in front of us to feel that for 30 seconds, for 60 seconds, for 2 minutes? And there's a profound healing that can happen. Oh my gosh, I didn't die. I can be with myself. I can sit with myself. This is a bold statement, but I actually think that's the #1 relapse prevention technique. Letting someone know, not by teaching them. We don't learn by hearing. I don't learn by hearing. Let me put that in the I. I don't really learn by reading or hearing. I learn by feeling, by experiencing. And early in my recovery, I thought, if I feel this, I will die. So I spent a decade running from my trauma in recovery. And as Jeremy said, what if our clients don't have to wait a decade? What if just in this moment, I hold enough space for you to feel whatever's happening and a healing can take place? I felt that and I didn't die. And then the work of integrating what we buried in the shadow can begin. Okay, we have some time for a few more. Thank you for that. Yes. Oh, we've got 2. Okay, perfect. We're getting her first.
I'll use the microphone and be considerate because you asked me to. Hi, I'm Marion Ross. I just wanted to touch on a couple of personal points.
Okay.
So I too come from a, okay, Jen, I'm following your lead here. Woo! I too come from a childhood with all different kinds of trauma.
Yeah.
And then when I self-medicated through drugs and alcohol, when I started, I didn't think that, I just thought it was a party.
Yeah.
I grew up in it. My mom was an addict, that kind of thing. Like, this is the way my life is supposed to be. I'm just going to enjoy it as it is. And then later on, through the process of recovery, it took lots of years of
Right.
that self-medication. And then I went to a program that was 18 months. I stayed in a program for 18 months, and it was co-occurring.
Yeah.
But at the time, I wasn't open enough to feel or to accept that level of trauma-based recovery.
Right.
So it wasn't until I got 20 years clean and sober that I made this decision. So I ran, what did you call it? What do you call it when I'm, God dang it, I forget. So I went into shoe shopping and purse shopping.
The brilliant strategy.
Brilliant strategy.
Yeah.
So my
Shopping is a
strategy-
brilliant strategy.
My brilliant strategies was shoe shopping and purse
Yes.
shopping and
Yes.
shopping and sex and
Yeah.
all those things. And then when I got 20 years clean and sober, I couldn't understand why I still had so much anger.
Yeah.
And then when I would be in a not a conflict, but when I felt myself protecting someone else,
Yeah.
I found that, like with my sponsees, I felt like when they were feeling a certain way, I jumped into protection mode. And when I went into protection mode, I carried it to a whole nother level.
Right.
And so at that moment in time, I thought, you know what, maybe I need to seek some therapy.
Yeah.
And at 20 years clean and sober, I went to seek some therapy. And I found that I was more open and understanding. But one of the things I'll have to say is that at that point in time, I had to do a couple different therapists and found the right one. But the first one wanted to like hypnotize me and take me back to this, and I said, you know what? I told her, I said, our relationship is over because the last thing I want to do is unforgive my mother, and so, because I had worked through that. And then I do want to say something about the pandemic, and then I'm in a woman in long-term recovery, 31 years clean and sober. And so, we had to really acclimate to, Zoom with 12-step recovery.
Yeah.
And I talked to my sponsees, the women that I mentor, and they're like, oh, I hate Zoom and I hate this. And I said, look at it as a way, how many times have you said, I need to change my meeting? I need to change the people that I'm going around. I need to, experience this. If you go to the same meeting at the same time, even on Zoom, you're going to, you're going to hear something, you're going to learn something. And we were able to do this in all different countries and all of that. But for me, what it did is my recovery was not broken. It enhanced my recovery because I was able to hear different people. There's a 7 a.m. meeting that comes on that's a spiritual meeting. And I started attending that 7 a.m. meeting, and people across the country were sharing their spiritual experiences, that they had experienced with similar stories as mine. So, it takes what it takes for us to be able to search and seek. Here I am in a pandemic, and I have to live with that person that's 6 feet away from me. Am I going to kill him or am I going to throw him out? And so you have to act, you have to make change.
Yeah.
You have to change what you're doing. And so for me, I found that through the pandemic, I learned a lot more about myself beyond what I experienced in therapy. But it helped me, it helped me be the person that I am today. So,
Wow, thank you,
anyway.
Marianne. I love that, and I want to say a couple of things about it. One, I want to go back to something that you said. At least it touched something. I don't even know if you were even saying this. But this idea that we can present to our clients about the brilliant strategy, that alone, I've had clinicians call me saying, I did your group, they read your book, just inviting the possibility that addiction was a brilliant strategy rather than a coping mechanism or a defense mechanism, their eyes lit up. And I want to drill in a little bit with it, because when we can help someone understand that most of the time our brilliant strategies are unconscious, right? That's why with conscious recovery, we want to get down to what's trapped in the unconscious, because that's where we start to heal it. So, for example, when things got really difficult, I found myself numbing out, or I wasn't present. I would literally lose time, right? Something would happen that was intense, usually something sexual that would activate it when I was in my 20s, or anger, because my mom raged a lot. I forgot to talk about that part, but she raged a lot. So I would go and I would numb out, and I would leave the room. And at first I was like, that's bad. That's bad. I shouldn't be checking out. I shouldn't be. And so then I'm like, wait, what if that's a brilliant strategy for survival? And then I can start looking at where it originated. That's the question I tend to ask. Where did this originate? And what I discovered is when mom and dad, when things were happening in my home that were scary, I went to my room, I closed the door, and I isolated, and I checked out through fantasy, and it saved my life. So it was a default. It was an automatic response when things got difficult. And so if I can help someone look at the brilliance of that as a starting point, and then start to look at where this originated, right? Because it's not really whether it's sex or shopping or eating. That's not really what it's about. Like, how many times you worked with a client, well, I'm not addicted to weed, I'm addicted to cocaine, right? It's not about the thing. It's about what's happening here. And when we can get to a place where it's like, oh yeah, so much love and compassion for myself, that unconscious strategy was to check out. I worked with a client once who was not going to be admitted to our program because his anger issues might not be clinically appropriate for the milieu, right? In other words, he might yell and scream and throw a chair, right? We've all been there. Well, I look at you, Marion, because we've had chairs. You've had a chair thrown at you, right? I've had a cup of iced coffee was my favorite. Okay, so I met with him for the first time, and we just sat for a minute, and I asked him, what do you think might be under the anger? Now that seems like such a simple question to me, but no one ever asked him that. Everyone sent him to anger management classes. Why are you so angry? Why are you doing this, and how do we get rid of it? When we started exploring the brilliant strategy that anger was for him early in life, he had this place of love and compassion for himself. Because I have this profound idea that we don't really change until we want to. And so can I start to explore for him where the anger started and how it is serving him before we look at how it's not. And then he gets to make a choice based on what he really wants. I don't know why what you said prompted that, but thank you for that. I think we're going to do maybe one more. Martin.
Hey everyone, I'm Martin. Thank you, TJ. The part I want to bring to this conversation, I didn't know what this was going to be about. I guess like everyone came, but I'm curious about. And I'll just be, for me, I do the spiritual thing, and I'm in 12-step for years, both.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, are there recovery homes for families and friends, or myself even? I've talked about an Al-Anon. I'd love to be checked in for 30 days to an Al-Anon recovery home. I go to a meeting every morning. That's my check-in. Are there people that are doing that? And if not, I would like to start one or be involved in a project.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the room just to yell out some resources, because yes, there are some. I can offer some. Anyone know of programs that really help the families of addicted people? I think the Meadows does some great work, yeah? Cottonwood.
Authentic relating is a very untraditional one.
Okay. CR Tucson, you said? There are others. So the answer is yes, and yes, there could be room for even more. So if anyone wants to talk with Martin afterward, On-Site is another one. Lori Jean Glass up in the Bay Area does incredible work through her Pivot program and through the Glass House, where it's 1 week intensives. Deep and powerful work. She doesn't know this yet, but we're going to get her to speak at the next Emergence. There, I said it, Lori Jean. Are you watching? Okay. Anyone else have anything else to say before I close?
I have one quick
Yes.
I just got a call. Somebody's sister showed up on her doorstep, strung out on meth. She wants help, has no insurance, no financial means. She's homeless. Anyone can help me find her a place to go.
If anyone can help. Okay. So what I want to say in closing, I like to open with gratitude and close with gratitude. And the gratitude that I have, and hopefully someone will see you after with a resource. This is a great room for that. Huge gratitude to Jen Carvalho. And I want to, there's a couple things I want to say. One, that along with Jeremy, the three of us came together with this idea for emergence, where we're looking at what's emerging. I want to say a couple of things. One, you were a very early adopter of conscious recovery. Thank you for seeing it, for understanding it, for knowing it, and for having the courage to bring it to 2 treatment programs and now to Discovery. And Joe, thank you for your yes as well. So I just want to really acknowledge you as a very powerful female leader in our field, which is a great little pivot. I want to do a little plug. Our next Emergence Conference, it's going to be easy to remember, Cinco de Mayo, and the following day, and our theme is going to be the emergence of female leadership in our field. Dr. Angela Chanter will be speaking. I mean, that alone, just come for that, right? Jen will be part of that, and that's a vision that Jen Carvalho has held, and I'm just going to name it. If you look at a website of most treatment programs, it's a lot of women, it's less women, less women, less women. All of a sudden you get to the top and it's a bunch of men. No, there's nothing wrong with that. But I want to add to that. Right? I want to add to that and really support females having a larger role in the leadership of our corporations, our companies, our treatment programs, our healing centers. So thank you for holding that as a mission. Okay, and then huge thank you to Jeremy Miller. I love you. I'm so grateful for who as we say, who you be. And then the last person I want to acknowledge is my husband, everyone. My husband, Will, is here. And our little son, Cowboy. Someone said, that's not your son, that's your dog, but he is our son. So thank you, everyone. I think I'm calling Jeremy back up to do the closing, but I love all of you, even if I don't know you. Thank you for your presence and your commitment to this profound and powerful work we do.